Welcome to SAM Conversation, an online program of South Asia Monitor. Our subject today is PLA on the line of control and the future course of India-China relations. It is our pleasure to welcome Dr. Kondapalli Srikanth, very well-known expert who's a professor in Chinese studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and an honorary fellow an honorary professor at the Institute of Chinese Studies. We have Lieutenant General PJS Pannu, who commanded the 14 Corps bang on the line of actual control and was the deputy of the Integrated Defense Staff. Both have a lot of experience in Chinese affairs. Let me start by going back to 2020, when I call it the second major Chinese aggression, if the first was 1962. There were various other aggressions on an almost daily basis between 1962, then after 67, and right till 2020. But a major Chinese aggression was in May 2020, and the first shock they got was what happened on June 16th. And when they lost, after killing 20 of us, they lost, we don't know, 43 is the so-called official figure, but it's possibly much more. And then the second shock they got then was of Indian Army occupying the Kailash Range, which they tried very hard. They tried very hard and succeeded in making us disengage from there. But they did not disengage from a number of positions then, and thereafter they have, I'll say the rate of inching forward has been quite alarming, with 2 bridges across the Pangong Tso, a lot of roads and villages. Let's take a view of Professor Srikanth.
Thank you very much, Col Anil Bhat, for the invitation to speak here. Greetings to my fellow panelists, General Pannu as well, and to the audience. Well, what has happened in the last 2.5 years is, of course, an armed stalemate between India and China, given the Chinese rejection of many of the treaties that were signed in 93, 96, 2003, and so on. The border stability, border management mechanisms have been thrown to the winds, and we have seen the bloody conflict on June 15th night, 2020. As you rightly mentioned, there was the obfuscation of these figures in China. There was a TASS news agency report of 45 people killed, while China officially mentioned about 4 killed in this conflict, while Western sources indicated about 120. And those who participated in the Galwan incident from the Indian side also recounted to roughly over 100 casualties on the Chinese side. So that is as far as the details of that conflict is concerned. But what is important is that we have an arms stalemate, despite the trade increasing in last year to $125 billion. But we have almost a stalemate in every other aspect. In diplomacy, Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited unannounced in March this year and had a cold-shouldered kind of reception in Hyderabad House and other places. There was the, of course, we continued with the SEO BRICS meetings, despite all the things happening at the bilateral level. Nevertheless, as Dr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, mentioned, unless until peace and tranquility prevails on the border, there cannot be any bilateral relations improving. So that is the bottom line that we have seen, and there is no relaxation in that regard, despite the two foreign ministers meeting in Bali recently. There was no other signaling that is available. So what has happened is then with the arms stalemate on the border, there is a rough estimate of over 60 to 70,000 Chinese troops mobilized across the line of actual control, as against a rough figure of 120,000 by the Indian side. We do not know exactly how much of these are clear pictures, but what we see is that the last 2 winters they have been mobilized, which indicates that there is a new situation that has arisen. In addition, of course, we had 16 corps commander level meetings between the two sides, and the last one was held only recently, a few days back, and that suggests that there is also a method to de-escalate and disengage in all the friction points, as the last year February Defense Ministerial meeting mentioned. Nevertheless, there is not much progress in a few sectors within the Ladakh Aksai Chin region, specifically in Depsang Plains and the PP 15A and other areas, and of course
PP patrol point,
Depsang Plains and the Chushul sector and the Demchok areas. So these have not yet been resolved, and hence there is the uncertainty on the border. Now, there is, as you rightly mentioned, there are also other developments across the, for instance, there is the 624 well-off society villages that China built, and in some areas bang on the line of actual control, or even within the Indian claimed areas, such as in Lungchu in Arunachal Pradesh, or in Panta in Bhutan, or the 13 border markers that were removed in Nepal, in borders with China. So this is another development which suggests that there is some escalation in the line of actual control. The other is, of course, the reports about Chinese troops or others visiting POK, Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and the speculation about the well-off society villages also being contemplated in POK areas. This is in addition to the other deployments that China is making in Tibet and other contiguous areas, specifically the areas related to the line of actual control. For example, we have the Western Theater Command 76th and 77 Group Armies mobilized, and the combined forces have now been deployed. There is the 6th High Infantry Mechanized Infantry Division from Kashgar, and the 4th Highland Mechanized Infantry Division from Aksu in Xinjiang. They have been mobilized, and a lot of other equipment as well, including the Type 15 tanks, which is about 38 tons. In addition, of course, the Type 99 main battle tank and new armored personnel carriers. In addition, there is the Mangshur Warrior vehicles and the PCL-181 howitzers and multiple rocket launchers. There are also the reports about surface-to-air missile batteries, Hongqi 16, Hongqi 17, Hongqi 7A, in addition to the S-400 missile system, ballistic missile defense system. Then there is also the Chinese Air Force J-20, J-20A, J-20Bs deployed in addition to the J-10 aircraft, and Su-27, that is the J-11, and the helicopters and others. China is also trying in the non-kinetic domain, that is in the cyber, IW, and electronic warfare. So in addition, of course, to the three warfares that China is waging in psychological, legal, and media. For example, the Global Times or others have been carrying a lot of propaganda stuff against India. So these are the larger developments that are happening, which suggest that the armed coexistence is still the norm between India and China.
Thank you, Professor Srikanth Kondapalli. You brought out a large number of developments. General Pannu, I'm sure you are also aware of all that's happening, and you made a small observation, but a major one, that there's a lot of misinformation also, which is or fake news also, which prevails. One thing that that I will briefly comment on before I hand over the floor to you, that despite the fact that it's been proved that Chinese soldiers' fighting capability is no match. I'm not being just saying that out of pride. It's a matter of fact. And despite all that, they have gone and extended their deployment right up till Arunachal Pradesh. And I think they have inconvenienced themselves to quite an extent, because they have had to requisition a lot of material to do so. Without going further, I hand over to General Pannu, please.
Thank you, Colonel Bhat, for getting me over to the South Asia Monitor. Very interesting discussion, and Professor Kondapalli has actually laid out how the military and the PLA deployment, reorganizations, and the development across the Indian borders happened. Well, history of last 2 years is known to everybody. But what happens is that China also puts out certain events which may have happened, may not have happened. China is great in diversion tactics. Chinese are certainly showing their hand, whatever can be seen from across the border, like building of bridges across Pegong So for making sure that the northern and the southern division in this area of Exai Chin can have a switch of forces, and they can have central reserves available. And central reserves will then be applied in a manner where the force ratios are supposed to be applied during actual war. I think over a period of time, what the Chinese have been doing, not only last 2 years, but I would say a decade, and slowly, as everybody has been talking about salami slicing, but I think strategically, they carry out many small tactical operations all across the northern front. These are small incursions, patrollings, aggressive patrollings, and during the face-offs, whatever the banal drill, of course, according to the agreements, used to be done, but then certain officers have been making comments that India must learn lessons. If they haven't learned in 62, we will teach you one again. So psychological warfare, along with the small tactical maneuvers, has been the tactics for very long, and as a result, they have encroached upon number of points. And very recently, in 2017, we know what happened in Dokala, and they consolidated there and still pushing around into Western Bhutan, as Professor Kondapalli was talking about. As far as the Eastern Ladakh is concerned, they came in, they tested waters, there was Indian resistance and there was Indian reaction, of course, to the advantage of the Indian army, and certain which the PLA had taken advantage because of the initiative that they have taken, and certain areas which are sensitive areas in Debsang, Y Junction and PP15A, they haven't gone back. There are certain reasons why they haven't gone back and why they moved back from certain areas, because certain areas they could not withhold, certain areas they actually maneuvered both at diplomatic, operational level and at the talks level, and they made the Indians actually realize that if we fall back from south of Pagongso, we would expect the Chinese also to fall back from certain critical areas, which they did, but they have consolidated a huge amount of territory by showing the presence and building infrastructure, which is good for them for rapid deployment. We have been building infrastructure over a period of time, such as DSDBO, right up to Daulat Beg Oldie, and denying them certain proactive approach which they had in that area, because they were highly mobile. They would actually show up in less, reaction time was lesser on their part. As far as the terrain is concerned, it is favorable for mechanized movement with their vehicles, which PLA normally moves around with vehicles. Some tanks, light tanks, of course, backing them up. But as we have built our infrastructure, I think the Chinese got forewarned that now the Indians would also bring in the mechanized elements and the vehicles, and they would also be mobile, and we can even go across to certain passes. And they felt that they must have the advantage of withholding those passes ahead of time, because it is a race to passes which was to give advantage to either of the forces. And anybody who holds the passes or dominates the passes or brings in forces much closer will be able to win the race to passes. So as a result, what they have done is they strategically have also decided to consolidate the borders, which they have done through building villages, bringing the civil infrastructure there, making the villages stay there to justify that this infrastructure was actually meant for the local Tibetans and local or the Chinese nationals, as they say. And the kind of logistic bases which they have made to support these villages and support the so-called Chinese nationals in that area are humongous, which is certainly a direct military implication of their capacity to hold on to this area, which is very difficult otherwise for troops to hold on. They have built habitat where the troops can now actually live in much more comfort than it was ever before made, though they had built string of posts which were very comfortable even earlier. They make the posts like actually small modern villages, but I think now they are also building cantonments which actually look like modern towns. So as a result, they're camouflaging a lot of development which is happening under the civilian infrastructure. The Indian Air Force has always been talking about the gains that the Indian Air Force will make, because you know the all of weight that Indian aircrafts can carry, and we will be able to dominate the airspace in Tibet area. I think they have understood that, and they have changed this by developing the airports, which is basically dual use, but largely which all of them have military capability. They have built huge number of helipads, and they brought in armed helicopters. They brought in helicopters of the kind which will be able to dominate the area, which will support operational level tactics, operational level, combat units. So as a result, what is happening is that with what is happening in the world is highly distracted towards Russia. The world is highly distracted towards what is happening towards Taiwan, the Quad and the AUKUS and all that which is happening. And of course, the news of China not doing too well. They're having internal problems in economy. They have suffered the COVID, and they have suffered the unemployment is growing, and the population demography is not in their favor. All that is there. But I think China also understands when to show the weakness to the world while hiding the strength. I think that is exactly what is happening. I think a lot of weakness is being put around, and the world is buying it. The world has actually started buying the weakness of the Chinese, and the Chinese are building the strength. I think they are hiding, they're camouflaging a lot of their strength, and they are building. they will strike at an opportune moment. Also what they are doing is wherever they are taking nibbling or tactical operations, they are building data. They are trying to understand how the Indians or the Taiwanese or the Japanese or Quad or AUKUS, all these militaries and how the geopolitics in the world is shaping up. They're also looking at the Taiwan-Ukraine equation. If Ukraine was supported by the Western world and the Russians were rattled about it, I think the same thing is happening in Taiwan because the Western world is supporting Taiwan. So it is China's Ukraine in a manner. So I think Chinese are looking at how Russians are dealing with the Ukraine operations and crisis, if I may choose to call that as crisis, and also trying to apply the same model because it is going to be West versus China as far as Taiwan is concerned. It is going to be India, which is going to be maybe a secondary objective after whatever gaining of upper hand vis-a-vis the Western world is concerned. I think they are weighing the pros and cons, how the international geopolitics is shaping up around them. And I think they are collecting a huge amount of data. They will take a decision and they will strike. And I think they are going to use Pakistan. They are going to use North Korea. They are going to use all their allies. Of course, their BRI is collapsing because what is happening in Sri Lanka. Their debt trap strategy is also, I think, but they will rewrite it. They are great ones to recorrect, and they will rewrite a lot of initiatives which they had taken earlier, which they are selling to the world as total collapse, but maybe they will do mid-course correction. I think we have to be forewarned. We cannot be complacent about it.
Thank you, General Pannu. That was quite a set of very interesting observations. And I think you made a great point about the good old Chinese method of deception. Deception is a very major ploy of theirs. Because this tremendous show of force, in the past also, we see that they're very good at projection of force that, oh, you better watch out. This is what all we have. But what they will do with it, how they will use it, that is a question I keep which keeps bothering me. Because whatever we have seen in 1967, in the skirmishes in Atula, Chola, and in Galwan, and so many other attempts were without. They've tried their best to keep the border bulletless, which they requested for, which they pressed for after 1967. They broke it with medieval weaponry, but not bullets in 2020. But anyway, there is no doubt about the fact that they are also trying whichever way possible, waging war by other means, which have been brought out by Professor Srikanth and General Pannu. My last point, which I put across to both, let's take it very briefly, but is that do we need to be more offensive than we have been so far? We have been maintaining that we know what's happening, and we are catering for it. Do we need to be more aggressive in whichever way, on the ground or on? I invite the views of both of you on that. Professor Srikanth.
Yeah, do we have to be more offensive in nature? At the moment, we are holding back against the Chinese aggression in Galwan, and this is reflected in various measures that we have undertaken, both in the Army deployments and Air Force deployments. There is, of course, also the Indian Navy, which is exerting pressure in the Indian Ocean region. And we also have the Quad Malabar exercises and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that has come about on May 24th this year. So that's a larger picture we have. Should we escalate, go into an offensive mode? I think it is not necessary because the Chinese are feeling the pinch. If you look at the 218 IT apps that were banned and the infrastructure investment ban and the Confucius Institutes closed down in India soon after the Galwan incident, we also see this May and this July, this month, we have the Enforcement Directorate swooping on Xiaomi and Vivo and Oppo,
Yes.
the mobile phone makers, and an estimated $4 billion has been taken as part of this money laundering and tax evasion that they have been doing, which means that as the Chinese CEOs have fled the country in order to escape the ED Enforcement Directorate's questioning, there is the pressure that is mounting on China in the economic field. And of course, if we decide on the escalation, and that depends on how many casualties or how much of escalation that we are going to see in the line of actual control areas. It appears at the moment, both the Indian side and the Chinese side, when we look at the 16 Corps Commanders meeting, it is conciliatory, but not completely progressive in nature before the Kailash Range occupation, of course. So what it means then is we do have the stalemate, and escalation is not possible because both sides appears to have decided to continue the Corps Commander level meetings and WMCC meetings between the foreign ministries on the border issue. So that is now the trend, and the offensive is in the other fields, like in the economy or in diplomacy or in strategy, which is where the Quad movements indicate. So we, not in the military field per se, although we are holding ground and we are continuing with the exercises and deployments and so on and so forth, and new patterns of warfare that are emerging that we are trying to adjust to. But as such, no military escalation in the line of actual control, partly because the mountains favor us. If China has to have an offensive operation, they require 8:1 ratio, and we are quite adequately deployed, both in terms of troops as well as in terms of equipment and operations. In the case of China, this is a Herculean task if they have to go offensive. In our case, we are, of course, doing a defensive operation right now and no thinking on the offensive. But in other fields, political, economic, strategic areas, we have seen the offensive. As I just mentioned, the enforcement directorates, raids and others. So that is the situation right now. And at the moment, we are quite comfortable with this. The only jarring note, of course, is that the Chinese have been building up those infrastructure facilities, and new highways are being planned, and the helicopter, and the air bases that they are initiating. That indicates to us something offensive portents in future, but we are adequately prepared for that sort of a contingency. If China is willing to give up a 30,000, 40,000 casualties, then of course that's a different situation.
Thank you. General Pannu, I request you to wind up with, whatever we, please.
Col Bhat, I think Professor Kondapalli brought in certain very pertinent issues about how Indians are treating the Chinese at all levels. And I think, and he feels that it is more than adequate currently dealing with them. But really speaking, if we look a little far ahead as to what will be the outcome of what we do and what are the objectives that we should have in mind as far as the military, political, and diplomatic objectives are concerned, I think those have to be very clear. And it's like, say you selection and maintenance of aim. We don't have to waver then. Anybody who has the first move advantage is the one who can select the aim and then execute to achieve those objectives. So far, we are going to remain reactive. Then we don't know what our aims are, because the aim is to react. And then if nothing happens, then do nothing. If something happens, then do something. And what is that? Something will depend on what has happened to you. So I would suggest that we need to slowly get out of this reactive mindset of this is what they have done and this is what we need to do. We need to have a long-term, very clear objective laid out with vis-a-vis China, and also how the Chinese influence is impacting our neighborhood, where we'll be talking about the string of pearls and all that. So I think at the diplomatic level, we need to make sure that all our neighborhood works with some synergy to allow the Chinese influence out. And I think some of them are quite convinced that what the Chinese have done to them is going to bring more harm than advantage, which they earlier thought that it was going to be an advantage to them. But it is again reactive. Just because Sri Lanka is collapsing and others may collapse, it is not because Indians did something about it. I think that is again reactive, that now that the string of pearl strategy has collapsed because the debt trap strategy of China has not worked. So now it is time for us to jubilate. But I think there the diplomacy has got to become more proactive, that how do you fill up this vacuum and fill it up for good, which is sustainable and which is also not threatening to our neighborhood, which is acceptable to our neighborhood, which will keep the Chinese at bay. I think this is a great opportunity for our diplomatic corps to exercise success in this area. For example, Nepal. Nepal absolutely lies between India and China, and it has been playing a game which suits them. And we have never been able to understand what exactly is required to be done to Nepal. And Nepal sometimes, has dispensation which is pro-Chinese, and sometimes in the next statement, they say something which is pro-India. And I think that is where we need to firm up and make our diplomatic objectives very clear. And obviously, political objectives are obviously there to balance the diplomatic and the military objectives. The military objectives are that we must be strong enough always not to allow any part of the territory where we get surprised and gets captured, and where we say that now you get out. Why did you allow them to come inside? That is the question. So military firmness on ground is extremely important. And once we are militarily firm and we do not allow any part of our territory where we can get surprised, and then we can negotiate with military strength. I think politically and diplomatically, you can negotiate better if you have your military marbles in place and you have adequate strength to be able to demonstrate your political and diplomatic resolve. But if you cannot translate your political and diplomatic resolve through military, then I think we need to, rethink about our strategy, that how we got to have a proactive strategy. So I recommend that the investment has to be made militarily, not only in the Army, Navy, Air Force, but also in the fourth and the fifth domain, that is the cyberspace and the space. There have been a number of cyber attacks, and cyber attacks happen on our critical infrastructure. And as we understand militarily, I think, as we understand militarily, whenever Chinese are attacking using cyber attacks somewhere, I think they're also collecting data as to what is your response system. And then they are the ones who are creating a data bank. If you do like this, this is how the weakness and this is the strength of the reaction comes in. And I think they are going to continue through salami slicing, not only on the borders, but salami slicing, not only on the borders, but also on our critical infrastructure through cyber attacks, and also through our space-based assets as to how our space-based efforts are deployed and how they are, using their space strength. So I think there's going to be a larger Army, Navy, Air Force, and the other domains all put together. I think that is what is going to contribute to a comprehensive national power. That is where the firmness will come in.
Thank you, General Pannu. Thank you. I'm glad you brought out this aspect of the importance of being proactive and not always being reactive. And well, all we can hope for is that we've had the 16th meet, which has been as inconclusive as the 15th and the 14th on the ones before that. They're great at carrying on these talks for 12, 13, 14, 15 hours. In future, when I think we can be a little more fluent in Mandarin, maybe the talks will take shorter. But in keeping with time, I will thank both of you for some very pertinent points brought out. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Professor Kondapalli. Pleasure.